Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started in just a minute. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sheila Shao, and I'm a member of the Central Committee of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I'm speaking to you today from Los Angeles, and I will be chairing the launching event for the new book, Climate Solutions, Beyond Capitalism. We're going to begin our program in just a moment, but before we do, I'd like to ask everyone watching right now to take a moment and share this on your social media pages and help our message reach more people. Thanks. As the crisis deepens with over 30 million people filing for unemployment and 1 in 5 children food insecure during the pandemic, the Trump administration and the US ruling class is working to roll back environmental protections. We are witnessing a true war against the working people and the planet. The news cycle is overwhelmed by crisis news. There's the actual medical crisis, the devastation caused as tens of millions of people lose their jobs, the politicians trading charges, anti-China racism, the stark exposure of capitalism as a system floundering to address basic needs, and the scientific drama as dedicated scientists struggle to find answers. The stories leave little room for anything else. Things like the melting ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica, rising carbon dioxide levels, melting permafrost, increasing wildfires, and other ominous signs of the greatest existential crisis humanity has ever faced. Much has been written about climate change, but few writers examine the central role that capitalism plays in the crisis. Tina Landis brings light to this connection in Climate Solutions, Beyond Capitalism, a book that offers a clear-eyed acknowledgement of the enormity of the challenge, but offers a path forward based on science rather than profit-driven high-tech schemes and wishful thinking. Her book calls on readers to organize, steering focus away from the doomers who preach that there's no way out of this. You can order the book at pslweb.org/store. We will first hear from Jody Dean, who is a professor of political science at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. She wrote the foreword to Climate Solutions Beyond Capitalism, in which she describes an evolving acknowledgement of climate change. We are excited to hear from her now. Please welcome Jody.
Thank you, Sheila. I'm really happy to be here to talk about Tina's important book. My daughter likes to remind me that 2020 wasn't all that great, even before coronavirus. The reality of climate change was making itself felt. Recall the fires in Australia, the deaths of millions of animals, the koala bears, and yet at the same time, it was becoming harder to shake the feeling that nothing was going to change, that the ruling class was going to do everything it could to keep business as usual, letting the sea levels rise and the warming increase and the permafrost melt and all the rest. The advice we were getting was individualistic. As individuals, we should combat climate change by switching to different light bulbs, eating less meat, walking to work, that sort of thing. Given the enormous scale and interconnected effects of climate change, it's hard to take this advice seriously. Most of us live too far away from our waged jobs to make walking feasible, and everybody knows how poor public transportation is in the US. Likewise, many people have switched light bulbs and altered their diets, and still our planet's air, land, and seas are getting warmer. The fossil fuel sector continues to expand, emissions increase, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere grows. Currently, there's an enormous glut of oil, classic overproduction, and yet the US government is bent on providing support to oil and gas companies instead of to unemployed workers and cities ravaged by the coronavirus. The inadequate and individualized advice that we got for climate change goes hand in hand with the gloom and doom. The ruling class doesn't want people to think that collectively we can change the world. We're seeing this play out with the US response to the pandemic. Capitalists want workers back to work, even as they, the capitalists, don't want to provide adequate PPE and distancing, much less paid medical leave. If workers refuse to work under these conditions, they can be fired, denied unemployment benefits, and they can lose their health insurance if they're lucky enough to have any in the first place. And yet we're told it's your choice. Well, it's not. It's coercion, plain and simple. The capitalist would rather have us focus on our individual choices, wants, and fears. And this is because the capitalist system can only persist so long as most of us think that changing it is impossible. But change is possible when we join together and struggle. This new book confronts the negative individualizing message of the capitalist class with revolutionary optimism. We can respond to climate change in a way that will save human and non-human lives, enhance community well-being, and strengthen working class power. We can respond by fighting for and building socialism. Capitalists pretend that the free market is already addressing the climate crisis. For example, they point to natural gas, nuclear energy, and expensive futuristic technologies for sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. None of these responses does anything but buttress the capitalist system and deflect attention from the work that needs to be done. Natural gas, championed by Barack Obama as a bridge fuel, has driven the fracking revolution. Not only does methane, the most common natural gas, not only does methane have greater warming properties than carbon, but natural gas has been the key to the US strategy for becoming a net fossil fuel exporter, that is, for US energy dominance and imperial power. Nuclear plants take decades to build. Their radioactive waste cannot be safely stored, and Native people have been some of the primary victims of the nuclear energy's storage of hazardous waste on their sacred lands. The risk of meltdowns from power failures make nuclear plants extraordinarily dangerous, as we learned most recently when a tidal wave struck in Fukushima, Japan. High-tech machines for carbon capture have not yet been built at a level that can scale. At this point, they're expensive to build and require a lot of energy to run. Capitalists want us to think that capitalism is adaptable and responsive enough to develop what is needed to adapt to the changing climate. What history shows is that capitalism's orientation toward profits means that it will exploit workers and the environment, squeezing the life out of both for the sake of private capital accumulation. Capitalists have hidden the evidence of the damage caused by fossil fuels. They offload the poisonous byproducts of their industry onto poor communities, disproportionately people of color. As is obvious to everyone, capitalism is not oriented toward justice and meeting the needs of the many. Of course, it can't solve the problems that accompany climate change. Capitalists today are also deeply worried that climate change might be the death knell of economic freedom, as The Economist magazine fretted in its special issue on the climate. And capitalists are right to worry. Most of us know full well that when it comes to profits, capitalists are oriented toward competition, not cooperation. They cheat and outdo each other in the race for larger shares of the market and higher profits. And they certainly are not concerned with improving the lives of workers. The system operates to keep wages down and profits high. It's no wonder then that the climate movement has come to embrace climate justice, the fight against a climate apartheid that sacrifices poor and working people and that demands a just transition. No equitable response to the climate crisis can be built on the backs of the working class and at the cost of the lives of the frontline and fence-line communities. Markets can't deliver a just transition because markets chew people up and spit them out, leaving them impoverished and unemployed. Climate solutions beyond capitalism rejects the lie that capitalism could ever provide a just response to the climate crisis. It demonstrates why we need a planned economy and provides concrete examples of a collective and sustainable approach to agriculture, land use, the oceans, and renewable energy. Socialism is the solution to climate change because at its core, climate change involves class struggle. Climate change has not been caused by everyone. Not everyone has benefited from industrialization. We see this most clearly at the international level. The US and the EU are responsible for the largest percentage of carbon emissions. The climate crisis is not the fault of the smaller developing countries, which have long been exploited by colonial and imperial powers like the US. It's also not the fault of the poor, who globally are disproportionately women and people of color. The top 1% are responsible for 175 times more emissions than the bottom 10%. And yet, the bottom 10% are the ones already feeling the impact of the crisis as they're forced to migrate, confront decreasing agricultural yields, and suffer from fires, floods, storms, and heat waves. Saving the planet, or more precisely, ensuring that the Earth remains livable for the majority of people and species, requires dismantling the U.S. war machine. The U.S. Army is the largest institutional emitter of warming gases on the planet. Its bases, occupations, coups, and illegal wars amplify the destabilizing effects of the warming climate. This tells us that the struggle for a just response to the climate crisis is also a struggle for peace. At a time when the world needs to come together to develop a collective response, U.S. imperialism is a major obstacle. We must build the socialist power necessary to remove it. Because climate change is class struggle, a struggle against imperialism, and a matter of relations of production, local solutions are not enough. The response to climate change has to be big enough to take on enormous corporations, the entire capitalist class, and win. Our task is to build a collective power capable of seizing the state. This will allow us to socialize the corporations, rein in and dismantle the military as an imperialist force, build new electrical grids, and change the transportation system while we reorganize life and work. Ending U.S. imperialism will also be a major step toward building the international trust necessary for global cooperation. Responding to the climate crisis is not a matter of individual morality and consumer choice. The individualizing focus on individuals' lifestyle choices is one of the ways capitalism tries to divert attention from the system as a whole. Instead of joining together to fight against a system that pursues profit over people, capitalism wants people to turn on each other and chastise one another for their consumer choices in a context where we're all actually dependent on consumer items for meeting our basic needs. What has to change is what is produced and how it is produced. And this will only change when the basic relations of production, of work, and ownership change. And this requires socialist revolution. Thank you, and thanks, Sheila.
Thank you, Jody. Tina Landis, the author of Climate Solution Beyond Capitalism, is a longtime organizer in the environmental and social justice movements, works in air quality regulation and climate protection, and holds a certificate in sustainable management. Her writing on environmental and other issues appears in Liberation News.
Through the current pandemic crisis, we see the complete disregard that the ruling class and their government proxies have for the working class, as we are all left to fend for ourselves, with the poor and people of color hit hardest. The ruling class only values workers as a tool for their own enrichment. Since the pandemic hit the US in March, Jeff Bezos has reaped $24 billion in profits by doing absolutely nothing other than super exploiting his workers. Bezos is just one example of the criminal nature of the capitalist system. It is the very nature of the system itself that enables this massive transfer of wealth from the workers to the parasites at the top. The trillions given to the banks and corporations could be used to immediately provide a guaranteed wage for all the unemployed, test kits and masks for everyone, equipment for hospitals, and so much more. The cruelty of the capitalist system is becoming more and more apparent by how, in the wealthiest country in the world, they can't even provide the basic needs for people in times of crisis. This is not due to a lack of resources, but due to the nature of capitalism that puts profits above all else. We are currently living in climate crisis. It's not some far off distant problem, it's happening now. And capitalism will always seek to profit off the suffering rather than meeting our needs. That is, in the absence of a mass organized fight back from the workers. Scientists have warned that the severity and spread of pandemics and vector-borne diseases will increase with climate change. As ecosystems are disrupted by land use changes and deforestation, and wildfires and droughts increase, the natural balance between species is disrupted, causing disease to spread. The warming climate is altering migration patterns, and habitat loss sends wildlife into closer proximity to humans. Also, as the world heats up, viruses adapt to survival at higher temperatures that are closer to the human body temperature, making it harder for our immune systems to fight. We must act, and we must act now. In 2018, scientists warned that we have 12 years to avert complete climate catastrophe, and the clock is ticking. I wrote this book, Climate Solutions Beyond Capitalism, after seeing many friends struggle with demoralization around the fight against climate change. I wrote this book to convey a different narrative than the mainstream media and academics. 98% of news stories on climate change focus on the problems and never discuss real solutions. I wrote this book as an urgent call to action and to show an attainable and positive path forward to an eco-socialist world. The narrative we're given requires that solutions fit within the confines of the capitalist law of profit and endless growth. It's a fantasy to think we can solve a planetary ecological crisis and still make profits along the way. We're told that carbon capture technologies, carbon taxes, and cap and trade programs are the only practical solutions. That we have to ensure that any climate protective measures are economically feasible for corporations to implement. While the world is getting hotter every year and atmospheric CO2 levels continue upward. The capitalist solutions, including the UN climate summits, are not only a dead end, but serve to diffuse the people's demands for comprehensive changes that are necessary for our survival. The pandemic, despite the great suffering, is opening a window to another way. It has brought the economic system to a standstill and is providing an opportunity to hit the reset button. Millions of workers are seeing that the system is failing them and are seeking another way forward. As we are sheltering in place, there are major reductions in air pollution globally due to lack of traffic. Here in the San Francisco Bay Area, where 60 to 70% of jobs can be done remotely, the shelter in place is demonstrating that this is a viable alternative to not only help the climate, but improve quality of life by eliminating long daily commutes. This is a reform that can be easily achieved under capitalism. But even this will be a struggle, in large part due to the power of the fossil fuel and automotive industries that will lose a large portion of their profits if we stopped commuting. But making the changes needed to stem climate catastrophe goes far beyond driving less and will take a systemic shift to make it happen. To solve the climate crisis, we must first and foremost eliminate fossil fuels. The technology exists to immediately shift to wind, water, and solar and still meet the world's energy needs. But this is just one piece of the puzzle. We also have to address how we grow our food, land use and development, restoration of ecosystems, where we live, work, and recreate, and the unsustainable level of extraction, production, and waste. We need to utilize the technology and science of today and at the same time humble ourselves and learn from the intelligent systems of nature and indigenous practices. I want to touch on just a few promising solutions that I outline in the book. This is not in any way an all-encompassing list, but some of the hopeful and innovative work that is being done globally. Scientists and ecologists struggle to fully understand the interplay of forces that create a livable planet in a stable climate, and even more so within a changing climate. So new discoveries regarding solutions are ever evolving as the crisis unfolds. Big agribusiness is a huge drain on the ecosystem, depleting and poisoning soil and water resources at the expense of biodiversity. The practice of regenerative agriculture does the exact opposite. It goes beyond organic methods to produce food and livestock in collaboration with the ecosystem instead of at odds with nature. Regenerative methods require no inputs, meaning no irrigation, pesticides, herbicides, or fertilizers, and actually see larger yields than other methods. It enriches soil and retains moisture by growing different plants and trees within the same plot of land. And grazing livestock in forested areas greatly reduces methane emissions compared to industrial practices, due to the fact that forage is easier to digest and their droppings are distributed around the area, acting as fertilizer. The link between the oceans and land use becomes apparent through the annual recurrence of dead zones along coastal areas. These massive die-offs of marine life are fueled by runoff from fields and lawns that contain high levels of nitrogen-rich fertilizers. Shifting to regenerative agriculture would not only be a sustainable way to produce food, but would prevent these dead zones and protect marine life, seabirds, and the health of surrounding communities. Oceans are the largest carbon sequestering mechanism on the planet. 7 out of every 10 breaths you take can be attributed to the aquatic life support system. As overfishing and warming waters disrupt the marine ecosystem, it is crucial to implement sustainable fishing practices and aid in ocean restoration. Research projects out of Cuba, Australia, and Miami are aiding coral reef systems through discoveries of heat-resistant algae and supercorals that can increase survival rates from bleaching events, as well as the development of coral nurseries to aid in reef recovery. As the oceans warm, the natural cycle of upwellings, which bring nutrient-rich waters from the depths, is slowing. This is causing ocean deserts that are completely devoid of life. Marine permaculture is attempting to reestablish these upwellings and at the same time create a habitat for marine life. The kilometer-scale permaculture arrays serve as an anchor for kelp forests that rise and fall with the ocean swells, pulling waters up from below and providing food and shelter for marine life. Sea level rise is a looming catastrophe that will affect more than 1 billion people globally. Natural solutions like restoring reef systems, marshlands, mangroves, and seagrass beds can serve to absorb rising seas, protect coasts from storms, and increase carbon capture mechanisms all at the same time. But governments are largely ignoring the crisis and will leave coastal populations to fend for themselves when the waters rise. The low-lying region of South Florida, for instance, which sits on porous limestone, is already experiencing sunny day flooding when king tides bring seawater into the streets. But the local governments are more concerned with maintaining property values and their tax base than taking action to protect people in advance of the crisis. Predicting how fast these will rise and by how much is challenging, but a 10-foot increase by 2050 is highly plausible. In any sane society, governments would be working with communities to address the risk immediately. But under capitalism, the coming crisis is ignored for short-term profits. Restoring natural lands and forests is also crucial to cool the climate, increase water retention, and build resilient ecosystems. We're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction, which is the first to be caused by humans. As we lose species, the ecosystem as a whole is weakened, leaving it more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. That's why it's crucial to curb development of wildlands for housing, extraction, and agriculture, and to restore what has been destroyed. If we restored only the previously forested lands with native species, those lands could capture 2/3 of all the carbon emitted since the Industrial Revolution. Leading mycologist Paul Stamets has demonstrated how mycoremediation, which is the use of mushrooms to clean up toxic soil and water, can restore formerly polluted sites to thriving habitats in just a few weeks and at a much lower cost than traditional bioremediation methods. When used on soil containing heavy metals, the soil and even the mushrooms that grew there were toxin-free. His extensive and innovative work on the use of mushrooms for a variety of ecological and medicinal solutions have lacked support for wider implementation due to the capitalist government's loyalty to existing industries whose profits would be hurt by Stamets' methods. This is the case for all these promising projects that I've highlighted. Under capitalism, funding is reserved for projects and research that have the highest potential for profits while maintaining business as usual, rather than funding the most effective solutions. The Pentagon is the largest consumer of fossil fuels and the biggest unregulated polluter on the planet. War, intervention, occupation of foreign lands is not about the security of the people in the US or the world, but serves only to enrich the capitalists by plundering resources, controlling markets, and increasing weapons sales. In the process, the US military and its imperialist allies wreak destruction on communities and the environment around the globe. Military operations leave behind a toxic legacy from domestic and foreign bases to war zones. 900 of the 1,200 Superfund sites in the US are former military bases. To solve the climate crisis, we need a system with an internationalist perspective of cooperation between nations, not aggression and domination. Lastly, I want to address the production system under capitalism. The rise of globalization in the early 90s saw a 400% increase in greenhouse gas emissions from shipping due to the outsourcing of production to other countries. This wasteful practice must be reversed to build a sustainable world. In addition to production of goods that are intentionally made to break after a short time, and single-use items cannot continue. If the rest of the world consumed the amount of resources of people in the US, we would need 5 planets to sustain us. While individually conserving more and consuming less is good, the climate crisis stems from the capitalist mode of production that disregards long-term sustainability for short-term profits. Just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of emissions since 1988. I work in a fairly forward-thinking environmental agency, and I witness how the courts protect the corporation's right to profit over the health of communities. This is the role of capitalism, the right of profits above all else. We live on a planet with finite resources, but the capitalist system has no regard for the survival of the next generation. To achieve a sustainable world, we need to be thoughtful about what we need and what we produce, how long we make it last, and how the materials can be repurposed after the product's life. In the US, 35 to 50% of food is wasted in normal times, which is an issue of distribution, not for lack of need. And under the pandemic, that rate is skyrocketing as farmers destroy crops and livestock as the industrial supply chain breaks down. We need a planned economy where the resources of society are thoughtfully used in a sustainable way for the long-term health of the people and planet. This can only happen under socialism, where workers determine what is produced based on need rather than some billionaires determining what should be produced for their own self-enrichment. Under an eco-socialist society, the resources, knowledge, and ingenuity of the people of the world could be pooled to mitigate the effects and adapt to climate change. In an eco-socialist system, we would all work less, and we would live, work, and go to school within close proximity. Everyone would have access to culture and recreation. The majority would live in eco-cities, like the ones being built in China, that are integrated into the ecosystem, increasing biodiversity, water retention, and lowering air temperatures. The majority of our food and goods would be produced locally to eliminate energy use needed for long-distance shipping. Rural areas would be connected to cities by high-speed, zero-emission transit and communally shared electric vehicles. And workers living there would have the same access to quality healthcare and education facilities, and recreation and cultural opportunities as urban dwellers. This is not utopian. What is utopian is a capitalist solution to the climate crisis. If we can envision a better world and organize ourselves, we can make it a reality. I urge those watching to not only read the book Climate Solutions Beyond Capitalism, but to join the PSL, to organize in your communities, to help build the movement for socialism, which is the only way to overcome the climate crisis and ensure humanity's survival. The workers are the majority. We make the world run. The current pandemic has shown how capitalism is completely incapable of providing even the most basic necessities for people. And every day, more and more people are looking to socialism as the path forward. The call to action, first written by Karl Marx and Frederick Engels in the Communist Manifesto over a century ago, takes on a new urgency in these times of climate crisis. We have nothing to lose but our chains. We have a world to win. Join us.
Thank you so much, Tina, for that talk. I really appreciate the action steps that we all can take to build the movement towards socialism, how we can save the planet. So now we have time for a few questions. Jody, can you talk about the impact of climate change combined with the coronavirus crisis on women and oppressed people around the world?
That's a really good question. So one of the things that is characteristic of both the climate crisis and the coronavirus is the extra burden that it puts on women. Around the world, particularly in societies where agricultural labor is a primary way that people meet their basic needs, women bear the brunt of that work, right? They were responsible for gathering wood, they're responsible for getting water, they're responsible for growing the small household crops that meets the family's needs. And as, let's say, as droughts increase, They have to go further to find water. They have a much greater burden when it comes to growing the small crops for their households. They have a lot harder time finding firewood. So just their everyday basic conditions combined with the ways that women's labor has been traditionally constructed place a much greater burden on these working women, right, in these agricultural societies. And the same thing is happening in a lot of countries like the US with the coronavirus, is that the women who do the care work, whether or not it's as nurses, whether or not it's as teachers, whether or not it's as women who are working in restaurants or at home to help provide food for their families, a lot of extra labor is coming onto women. And so it's just incredible how both of these crises have an effect that's much, much greater on women. It's also the case that both of them have a much greater effect on people who have been traditionally racialized, marginalized, and oppressed. We've been seeing the statistics in the US that African-American people, Latinx people are disproportionately those who have been affected and who are dying. And we know that around the world, people who live in fence line communities, that means in the areas around oil fields, oil distilleries, the kind of the factories and oil storage places, they have a lot higher instance of various kinds of respiratory illnesses. So again, they are the ones who essentially are paying the price of the capitalist system's embedded inequalities and the failure of capitalist states to have any kind of even semi-just response to them. So both the climate crisis and the COVID crisis are crises of reproduction, of social reproduction, and crises that are disproportionately affecting women and people of color.
Thank you, Jody. Tina, can you speak in general to how a socialist system in a place of abundance like the US would address climate change?
Under a socialist system in a country like the US, where we have an abundance of wealth and resources, the workers of the country could really look at what is needed for humans, society, as well as what's needed for the planet. Like, we could retrain workers immediately to build more solar and wind infrastructure, to shift off fossil fuels, to build these eco-cities that I referenced. All the jobs that are, not really needed in society, like advertising and insurance companies and things like that, all those workers could be retrained in some field that is actually beneficial to society. And we need way more nurses and doctors and healthcare workers than we have currently. And we can focus on that, and more education for everyone. Under a socialist system, we would all be lifelong learners. We would have time for that because we would all work less. We would time for pursuing cultural activities and, learning new skills constantly throughout life. So it would really be pooling society's resource and knowledge to address the needs of humanity and the planet, instead of all being in competition with each other for survival, instead of all of us competing for jobs and housing and school. We would all work together to solve the problems of society.
Thank you to both of our presenters today. Climate Solutions Beyond Capitalism is available in both print and Kindle versions. The print version is available for $7.95 at pslweb.org/store. The Kindle version is available for $4.95 at Amazon or in the Kindle store. For any bulk orders, distributor, bookstore, or review copy inquiries, you can contact info@liberationmedia.org. I want to remind everyone that you can follow PSL on social media at PSL Web on Twitter and Instagram, and can read our analysis on liberationnews.org. And remember, thinking about socialism is good, thinking and talking about socialism is better, but building a revolutionary socialist party is best of all. If you're interested in joining the PSL, apply online today at pslweb.org/join. Thank you all for tuning in today.